All right, folks, welcome back. Let's talk about how oxygen loads onto hemoglobin and the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So, first of all, this is a solution in a beaker of oxygen floating around. And what we're going to do is we're going to add hemoglobin to one of the sides of this semi-permeable membrane. And you're going to see how when oxygen binds hemoglobin, it changes the equilibrium. So let's go ahead and add hemoglobin there. Now look at that. Oxygen binds the hemoglobin. And when it does, now what's going to happen is the free dissolved oxygen here is going to re-equilibrate. And there it goes, it's re-equilibrating. So with hemoglobin in solution, it actually allows you to carry more oxygen because you reach a new equilibrium. So that's what happens in our blood. Uh, in our blood, hemoglobin carries oxygen and CO2. So let's talk about the CO2 fraction for a second. CO2, 70% of it floats around free as carbonic acid or bicarb. And no, they're not the same thing. But what happens is carbonic acid is a weak acid, so it spontaneously deprotonates into H++ bicarb. So some books will say 70% of CO2 is carried by bicarb. Now, why do I say it's bicarb if carbonic acid is a weak acid and doesn't completely deprotonate? Well, because your blood pH is 7.35 to 7.45, so even weak acids are disassociating. So 70% of your CO2, we probably would be more precise to say is carried as bicarb. And by the way, I know you already know this reaction, but you need to know it again. Once again, you have to know the carbonic anhydrase reaction and the deprotonation of carbonic acid to bicarb. About 23% of CO2 is carried attached to the globin part of hemoglobin. It's not competing for oxygen. Oxygen is on the heme, but on the globin part of hemoglobin, CO2 binds, and we call this carbaminohemoglobin. Notice I didn't say carboxyhemoglobin. Carbaminohemoglobin is when CO2 is attached to the globin. Carboxyhemoglobin is when carbon monoxide is attached to the heme. So carbaminohemoglobin and carboxyhemoglobin are two different things. And then CO2 floats around about 7% of it's dissolved. And when we get to the oxygen, you're going to see oxygen is much less soluble in plasma. It's a much lower number. 7% of CO2 is dissolved. Now this is the oxygen. So you can see that the hemoglobin, the oxyhemoglobin, is on the y-axis and the amount of oxygen or PO2 is on the x-axis. And I want to give you this one number that helps us to look at this graph. And that one number is called the P50. And what it is it's the PO2 at 50% saturation. So it's about what, 28? So the P50 is about 28. Now think of this. If I require more oxygen to get 50% saturated, that means the hemoglobin doesn't have a great affinity for oxygen. So if my graph were to look like this, and my P50 was way out here, this would be about 48. If I require more oxygen just to get 50% saturated, that means the hemoglobin doesn't like oxygen very much. It has a lower affinity for oxygen. Whereas if my graph looked like this, and I require less oxygen to be 50% saturated, that means my hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen. So I look at the P50 and it helps me describe what hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen is. That's what it allows me to describe. And by the way, this graph right here is called a right shift because it's shifting from a normal dissociation graph. And this graph right here is called a left shift. So in other words, a right shift shows you hemoglobin with lower affinity, and a left shift shows you hemoglobin with higher affinity. And these graphs show you that. But they're showing you one thing. I get a right shift from low pHs. And I'm going to tell you right now, right shifts occur for everything going up. Even, well, you're going to say, well, no, my pH went down, but that's high hydrogens. High hydrogens is low pH. High hydrogens make the right shift. High 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, that's we're going to talk about it, makes a right shift. High temperature makes a right shift. What else? High temperature, high 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, low pH or high protons. Well, I'll think of other things in a few minutes. These things all make a right shift. And then low things make a left shift. Low protons, by the way, that's a high pH. Low 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Low temp. So I can see my right and left shift here. And remember, the right shift is a lower affinity for oxygen, and a left shift is a higher affinity for oxygen. Now, why would we want our hemoglobin's dissociation constant to shift all over the board? Well, we want a right shift when we're at our tissues, because we want to unload the oxygen at the tissues. So we want hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen to go down when you're at your tissues. And we want a left shift when we're at our lungs, because we want oxygen to load onto the hemoglobin at the lungs. So physiologically, we cause right and left shifts, although pharmacologically, some drugs can cause right and left shifts, and toxins and drugs of abuse. But physiologically, we also do it. This is showing you the temperature. So higher temperatures cause a right shift and lower temperatures cause a left shift. So you can see that there. So you can see what fever would do to us. And this is just a collage showing you both of them together. Now, there are some hemoglobins that cause a left. There's actually some hemoglobins that have a left shift and some hemoglobins have a right shift. This fetal hemoglobin, it's called hemoglobin F, that has a left shift. That means it has a higher affinity for oxygen. Now, why would that be? Well, think about it. Your fetus is getting its oxygen from you, the mom. You're carrying your oxygen on hemoglobin. Well, how does the fetus get your oxygen preferentially? And the answer is hemoglobin F, or fetal hemoglobin, has a higher affinity for oxygen than does adult hemoglobin. By the way, if you're interested, hemoglobin F is an alpha 2 gamma 2 hemoglobin, whereas adult hemoglobin is alpha 2 beta 2. And I'm not going to test you on that. That's just if you're interested. So you can see that the beta chains don't exist on fetal globin F. It's gamma chains. Whereas on adult hemoglobin, you got 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. So fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than does adult hemoglobin. All right, this is showing you gas transport. Remember that 70% of CO2 is actually, it says 70% is converted to carbonic acid, and most of that is actually bicarb. So remember that most of your CO2 is carried as bicarb. Some of it's hooked to the globin, 23% of it or so, and some of it remains dissolved, 7%. Now that's not going to be true. That's not going to be true for oxygen. Most of oxygen, 98.5 to 90, above 98.5% of it is carried on hemoglobin. So most of our oxygen is here. Let's just say, I think your book's going to tell you 1.5% is dissolved. So 98.5%. of oxygen is carried on hemoglobin. That's different than saying hemoglobin is 99% saturated. That's different. So I don't want to confuse you. If you look at if you had 100 oxygen molecules in your blood, 98 and a half of them would be attached to hemoglobin, and one and a half of them would be floating around free. But that is very few oxygen molecules in your body, really, and your hemoglobin is nowhere near saturated. So we're going to talk about hemoglobin saturation as well here shortly. Most of your oxygen is carried by hemoglobin. So hemoglobin picks it up in the lungs and delivers it at the tissues. And with CO2, the CO2 is picked up in the tissues. I'm looking for that. CO2 is picked up in the tissues and it's delivered to the lungs to be exhaled. And here's the collage. So make sure you know how this gas moves, which direction the gas is moving and what's happening to it once inside the blood. The directionality of gas movement we already did, but make sure you understand that we're picking up oxygen in the lungs and getting rid of CO2. We're delivering oxygen to the tissues and picking up CO2. And make sure you know where the gases go. Oxygen goes on to hemoglobin, almost all of it. CO2, however, is in 3 different phases. One is bicarb, one is 7% of it's dissolved, and about 23% of it's actually hooked to the globin of hemoglobin.
Whether you're racing in a triathlon or doing something less strenuous, you need to breathe in oxygen to help you get energy, and breathe out carbon dioxide, a waste product. When you inhale, your diaphragm and rib muscles contract, increasing the volume of your lungs. When you exhale, these muscles relax, decreasing the volume of the lungs. When the lungs expand, air pressure in the lungs drops, causing air to flow into the lungs. When lung volume decreases, air pressure increases, causing air to flow out of the lungs. Air enters the nose or mouth, moves down the trachea, and goes into the 2 bronchi. Air moves down smaller and smaller bronchioles until it reaches a tiny sac, an alveolus. Each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries. Oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the alveolus. As blood flows through the capillary, it becomes rich in oxygen. In the blood, oxygen diffuses into a red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin, a protein made up of 4 subunits. 1 oxygen molecule can bind to each subunit. Oxygen-rich blood flows from the lungs to the heart. Which pumps this blood to capillaries all over the body. Here, we see oxygen diffusing from a capillary's red blood cells into a muscle cell. Oxygen is used by the cell's mitochondria to produce ATP during cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is released. How does carbon dioxide leave the body? Carbon dioxide diffuses from cells into capillaries. Some carbon dioxide stays in the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. Most carbon dioxide, however, enters red blood cells. Some carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin. The rest is converted to bicarbonate, which diffuses into the plasma. This oxygen-poor blood flows back to the heart, which pumps it to the lungs. There, carbon dioxide diffuses from the plasma into the alveolus. Bicarbonate enters red blood cells and is converted back to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is also released from hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the red blood cells into the plasma and into the alveolus. When you exhale, air flows out of your lungs. And that's how you release carbon dioxide, get oxygen, and keep on running.
All right, so that's it for this, folks. The last section is going to be the brainstem control of breathing. Make sure you read that closely in your book. It's really not hard, and when I lecture on it, you'll see that. But there's a lot of nuances and some subtleties between the dorsal and ventral respiratory group and the apneustic center from the pons and the pneumotaxic center as well. So we'll go through it on the next section and just make sure you read that as well. A couple little subtleties and nuances that you need to get your head wrapped around. All right, see you in the next section.